Hello, I'm Sharon Stern-Gersman. I'm a lawyer in Buffalo, New York, and I'm honored to serve as the National Law Day Chair for the American Bar Association. I welcome you to today's Law Day program. First, a tremendous thank you to our partners at the Law Library of Congress and the ABA's Standing Committee on the Law Library of Congress for their partnership in planning and leading this program. Law Day is an annual celebration formally recognized on May 1st to reflect on the role of law and the rule of law in supporting America's democracy and representative government. It was first observed nationally through an act of Congress signed by President Eisenhower in 1958. Every year since then, the President has issued a proclamation to focus the commemoration. Please visit www.lawday.org for more information and resources in conducting your own Law Day celebration. This year's Law Day theme is Cornerstones of Democracy: Civics, Civility, and Collaboration. In recent years, tensions in our democratic system have revealed deep divisions in American society. These divisions are aggravated by insufficient understanding about the Constitution and the way American government works, incivility in public discourse, and partisanship in our institutions. America is not unique in this respect. Our discussion today explores what might inspire us about these cornerstones: civics, or as it's called abroad, citizenship, civility, and collaboration from other nations. We hope to learn from our allies' experience and put it to good use in our own national conversation. A program like this needs an excellent moderator, and we have one. Nick Allard is the founding dean of the Jacksonville University College of Law in Jacksonville, Florida. He then served as dean of Brooklyn Law School 2012 to 2018, where he also concurrently served as president and professor of law. Nick is a distinguished attorney, currently senior counsel based in the Washington, D.C. office of Denton's U.S. LLP, the largest law firm in the world. He has received recognition and awards as a visionary for his work in public policy, as well as counseling clients in the fields of privacy, telecommunications, advanced broadband network communications, technology, health, energy, environmental law, compliance, and higher education. Nick is an active member of the American Bar Association, currently chairing its Standing Committee on the Law Library of Congress. He is a Rhodes Scholar and holds an MA in Politics, Philosophy, and Economics from Oxford University. His legal education continued during clerkships with the late U.S. Chief District Judge Robert F. Peckham, Northern District, California, and the late U.S. Appellate Judge Patricia M. Walt of the D.C. Circuit. I can't say enough about my friend and colleague, and know this will be a lively conversation. Thank you for joining us this Law Day, and I hope you enjoy today's program.
Well, thank you so much, Sharon. We really appreciate it. Should I carry on? I'm just going to power through because our time is precious. So yeah, thank you, Sharon, for that very generous introduction. And I'm just going to get right to it while saying that I don't believe the topic that was chosen this year could be any more important and any more timely. And you're going to hear why from our first speaker, which is our ABA president, Deborah Enix Ross. Now, Deborah is a senior advisor to the International Dispute Resolution Group of one of the most prestigious law firms in the world, Debevoise and Plimpton in New York City. She served as the chair of the ABA's Policymaking House of Delegates. chair of the ABA Center for Human Rights, and chair of the ABA International Law section, where she co-founded its Women's Interest Network. Deborah's led an international legal delegation to several countries, including Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Ghana. And before she joined Deborah Voice in 2002, Deborah served as senior legal counsel with the Arbitration and Mediation Center of the World Intellectual Property Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. She's also a director of international litigation with Price Waterhouse, was a director, and the American representative to the International Chamber of Commerce International Court of Arbitration. She started her legal career as a legal aid lawyer with MFY Legal Services in New York City, and so her entire career has always been of the highest excellence, but she has always made time to give back to our beloved profession and to the public and to others. It's my privilege to turn this over now to President Deborah Enix-Ross.
Thank you, Nick, for that very, very generous introduction. I was listening to it going, gee, that makes either I'm a person who likes to move around or can't hold on to one situation, but I do think that part of my desire to work in the legal profession was also to help enhance and build on the legal profession. And so that is why, as president, it was important to me to focus on the theme this year for Law Day, which is Cornerstones of Democracy, as we've heard, civics, civility, and collaboration. And I chose this theme because if you think about it, the goals of the Cornerstone Project are to foster community dialogue, to improve understanding of the rule of law, and to help restore confidence. That's that fourth C in our democratic process and our democratic institutions. And I think that the way that we can do that is we have to engage the public with our democratic institutions in a peaceful and respectful way. So that's the civility. We have to engage from a standpoint of constitutional knowledge. That's the civics piece. And we have to act in concert with others, because it's not just the legal profession that, although we should be leading in this area, we need to partner, collaborate with other professions as well, to make sure that we are using all of our tools and engaging all stakeholders in this very important work. So I'm thrilled to be a part of this discussion and look forward to hearing from the other panelists.
Before we get to the other panelists, I just ask you two very brief questions. Can you tell us a little bit more about why? You've described the importance of the topic, but can you tell us a little bit more about why you were so instrumental in choosing this topic in this year when it seems to be needed so much?
Yeah, so what I thought about is, as I was beginning to plan to become ABA president, which is a pretty long ramp up, I noticed that a lot of my non-lawyer friends were asking me questions. And for those of us who are lawyers, we know that if you have friends that are in family that are not lawyers, they think that if you're a lawyer, you know about every area of the law. So they'll ask you criminal law questions and con law, they'll ask you everything. But what I did notice was that the kinds of questions they were asking really boiled down to rule of law. Now, they weren't articulating it in that way, but it also indicated to me that there wasn't a really good understanding of our three branches of government at the federal level and what they're supposed to do and where they overlap or don't overlap. And so it was really civics questions. And then there were also civic engagement questions. And so that's how I began to formulate the idea that we really have to almost go back to basics in explaining to our fellow citizens how they can engage in our society in ways that are productive and not destructive. And really the art of civility to indicate that even though we may have differing viewpoints, that we can come together, we can discuss our differing differences, and then have an ability to move forward in productive ways. So that was really the basis back in 2018 when I was thinking about becoming ABA president. And I have to say, for me, I think it has been very gratifying to see that this has resonated not only within the legal profession, not only in the US, but generally around the world. Whenever I speak about this topic, as Sharon indicated, instead of saying civics, I might say civilization, or I might say citizenship, and then it's the same kinds of conversations worldwide.
Thank you. Now, the quick, big question, but maybe briefly you could give us a little bit idea. The topic and Law Day, the topic of Law Day goes far beyond Law Day. So what kinds of things are going on within the ABA, and what can others be doing to uphold our civic responsibility, our professional responsibility to educate the public about the rule of law?
Yeah, so you're right. Law Day is one day which we really celebrate Law Month. It really, I guess at some point we should say. But that it's an ongoing conversation, and it's ongoing projects and activities that help promote the rule of law. So here just are a few examples. And again, thinking about the collaboration, I started out with the University of Miami. That's where I went to both undergrad and law school. Can't help but throw up the U, have to do that. But I went to the University of Miami School of Communications and Journalism and talked to them about what journalists can do to help promote these cornerstones of democracy. We've had conversations with the Center for Strategic International Studies and Civics in the Workplace, and we have a pilot program that's going to happen at Nationwide Insurance so that their employees can talk about civics in the workplace. So it really is beyond the one day, and hopefully we have concrete steps that we can all take to promote these cornerstones.
Thank you. Well, and I just take some liberty and just add, not that you need any icing on that wonderful cake that you just delivered to us, but it is our continuing and constant obligation as lawyers to help inform the public about how our legal and constitutional government system is supposed to work.
Yes.
And there's a profound lack of knowledge for a variety of reasons that we can't get into. And so we cannot do enough as lawyers. I know my great friend, former classmate, Robert, the late Chief Judge of the Second Circuit, Robert Katzman, whose life is being celebrated around this time at NYU, was extremely outspoken about how important it was for every lawyer to engage. And basically what he would say is that our entire constitutional system, our beautiful system of limited self-government pursuant to a constitution and democratic will of the people, is subject to the informed consent of the public. And unless they are informed, they can't give informed consent. So it's sort of a very simple, powerful thought. And we need to do more as lawyers. And this is a wonderful day and month, but we have an ongoing obligation. So I'm going to move on, and we have two outstanding scholars who are with us who can complement our perspective about Law Day, civility, collaboration, and civics by offering an international perspective. And I know, because I was fortunate enough to have an opportunity to live and study overseas as part of my education, that you can get a much better affection and much better understanding sometimes from being outside looking back And so we thought, and this was Deborah's idea very much, is to, with her international perspective and practice, to include this in the conversation today. So this is really a unique opportunity. I'm going to introduce both and then put some questions to them. Kayanan Katakan is a foreign law specialist at the Law Library of Congress, which is a wonderful institution. And I'm very proud to be the chair of the standing committee, the ABA Standing Committee on the Law Library of Congress. It's been so worthwhile working with the outstanding people who make that law library so special. His work focuses on the laws of Turkic-speaking jurisdictions, Greece and Cyprus. He holds a PhD in law from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, an LLM from King's College London, and a BA in law from Koç University in Istanbul. Kayahan regularly contributes to the Law Library of Congress blog, Global Legal Monitor. You can find him there, Global Legal Monitor, with articles on current legal developments. We'll be hearing also from Ruth Lavush, and she is a senior foreign law specialist at the Global Legal Research Center at the Law Library of Congress. She conducts research on Israeli domestic law, comparative law, and international law. Ruth's work has been cited by the U.S. Supreme Court. Her reports have been admitted as evidence and her expert testimony by various U.S. federal courts. Ruth has authored numerous publications and is a frequent presenter at professional gatherings and webinars on a variety of legal topics. She served as a special assistant in the Israeli Supreme Court for Chief Justice Aharon Barak, and as an attorney with Israel's Minister of the Treasury and in private practice. She holds a master's in comparative law, American practice from GW University, that's George Washington University, and an LLB from the Tel Aviv University Law School. She's a member of the DC Bar and was admitted to the Israeli Bar. So those are two extraordinary people, and I've got to say, they are not only incredibly talented and dedicated in their work, but they're emblematic of the quality of the other people who I've encountered, and many other people we work so closely with at the ABA, and who are just extraordinary, managing the treasures of the Law Library of Congress. I guess I'm going to start with Kyle and ask him. I'm going to ask him to discuss maybe the methods that other jurisdictions use that he's aware of, and any survey or research or work that he's done about efforts around the world and in the jurisdictions he's covered that generate and foster bipartisan cooperation and engagement and knowledge of civics in the local population. So I'll put that question to him, and then we'll get back to Ruth.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Nick. In fact, I did participate in a research looking at these questions. In 2020, I coordinated a report, a multi-jurisdictional report on civic education models. And this report was published in June 2020. It is on our website at law.gov. It is open to the public. Anyone can access it. And this survey report looked at 22 selected jurisdictions to see how these jurisdictions were offering civic education courses in their formal education system. Of course, civic education classes offered in formal education is just one type of civic education that governments can provide. For example, I think that in the Library of Congress and in the Law Library in particular, we are a civic education institution. and we provide civic education programming all the time. But this is like a particular subset, which is the classes, the civic classes that we take in school. So this report was particularly looking at that sort of civic education. So we looked at 22 jurisdictions. Most of these were OECD countries, but not all of them. And we found interesting differences between these countries. But all of them were in one type of another, providing civic education classes. And I think the central insight there, all of these governments that were offering this in their national curricula or their subnational curricula, was that, as Deborah, I think, very correctly puts, civility is an art, but also civility is a skill. It can be taught, at least to a certain level, and I think this is the central insight that all these governments have in mind. It can be taught at a young age, at least the basics. And it must be, because it is like a language. If you don't have the fundamentals, it is very difficult to come to a common denominator. That it's a method, and the insight is that this can be taught. So as I said, the methods that these countries were using, they were very diverse. Pedagogically, the pedagogic method that is being used was different, but also the grades in which these civic education classes were put in the curricula were different. But there were some, similarities, and I'd like to talk a bit about the content, the common content that we saw. First of all, most of these programs focused on providing some basis of a common identity, a common denominator, right? So some jurisdictions concentrated on, moral and cultural values, these modules that taught moral and cultural values. Some, had classes on national history, but some countries which, espouse this idea as a foundational identity, their value for diversity. So these core classes included diverse classes that taught about the importance of diversity and other, minority cultures that existed in the country. Also very common among jurisdictions was the classes on civic and political organization of the state, and the rule of law, of course. These were usually followed by modules on the rights and duties as citizen, and how to use or how to be an active citizen, how to vote, and that sort of thing. So, classes on common identity, on the civic and political organization of the state, and the rights and duties of a citizen, and how to use your rights. This seems to be the old core of civic education models in these jurisdictions. We see these in as a comparatively new development, that some soft skills and modules on global citizenship are being also included in national curricula, supplementing these, the core civic education frameworks. Respect for, especially, more recent additions were things like classes that taught, respect for pluralism, for cooperation, solidarity, and human rights, and global citizenship classes, which included things like intercultural relations, but also familiarity with the global economy, digital literacy, and some core values such as tolerance and understanding of differences and that sort of thing. One last point is that the United Nations, for example, in its Sustainable Development Goals, has a thematic indicator, which is one of these, the measures by which they measure whether a country is, going towards one of the Sustainable Development Goals that they've determined, and this indicator is like the percentage of students by age group showing adequate understanding of issues related to global citizenship and sustainability. So we're seeing more and more maybe how countries have started to see civic education as a fundamental as an important part in their development strategies, but also their standing in the global community. So this is what we saw in our report, and I would it is open to the public, and anyone who's interested in these topics are welcome to download and look at it.
And I believe that Robert Brammer has provided the link in the chat, so everybody can find the link to the study materials there. Let's turn to Ruth, and basically, Ruth, can you take a swipe at the same question, which is basically, in the countries, the nations that you cover, what have you seen that people do to contribute to better civics, civility, collaboration? And I'm particularly interested, I think it's a particularly fraught time and difficult in Israel. So I'd really like to hear very much about your insights in that nation that you know so much about.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to take part in the conversation. My statements today reflect my personal views and not those of the Law Library or the Library of Congress. According to Israel's president, Yitzhak Herzog, Israel is currently experiencing the most serious internal crisis in its history. Unlike in the United States, the Israeli president is not the head of the executive branch, that is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and President Herzog has mainly ceremonial duties. In a recent interview ahead of Israel's 75th Independence Day, he explained that the legal reforms advanced by Prime Minister Netanyahu's government have brought to light deep disagreements beyond the specific legislative proposals. For those not familiar with the recent developments, Israel's new coalition government enjoys the support of 64 of the 120 members of Israel's unicameral parliament, the Knesset. In January, it had introduced a legislative package that would, and I'm quoting from the coalition agreement, ensure governance and strengthen the ability of the government to implement its policy, end quote. The means to achieve this objective includes the enactment of laws that would overhaul the judicial system and limit the High Court of Justice authority to conduct judicial review over Knesset legislation and of executive actions. The reforms would similarly transform the Attorney General and ministerial advisors into political appointees. According to Israel's Attorney General, the main mean of achieving a balance of power in the Israeli system of government is the independence of the judiciary and the Supreme Court in particular. The ministerial legal advisors, and especially the Attorney General, are also considered to be legal gatekeepers and thrusted with the task of promoting government policy while upholding the rule of law across the executive branch. The government proposed reforms have met massive public opposition, with hundreds of thousands of Israelis participating in marches and demonstrations throughout Israel for the last 16 weeks, expressing their fear that the reforms in effect constitute a regime change. Israel does not have a written constitution, but rather a number of basic laws that serve as fundamental laws for structuring Israel's government. Opponents of the reforms argue that in the absence of a constitution and a Bill of Rights, and in the absence of a system of checks and balances, such as a bicameral parliament, a federal system, an independent judiciary with judicial review, regional representation, etc., giving the government unrestricted power will harm the democratic character of the state. Under the current system, some individual rights are guaranteed under basic laws. However, rights such as freedom of speech, freedom of demonstration, freedom of the press, and the right of equality are not provided in laws, but have been established in decisions of the Supreme Court based on principles enshrined in Israel's Declaration of Independence. The declaration declares the establishment of a Jewish state that will be open for Jewish immigration, that will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants, and that will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. The declaration says that the Jewish state, known as the State of Israel, will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principle of the Charter of the United Nations. The fierce debate over the proposed reforms reflects different views regarding the fundamentals of civics in Israel. What is the meaning of the Jewishness of the state? How should the state of Israel balance its Jewish character with its democratic character, as is reflected in the Declaration of Independence? What are the respective authorities of the branches of government in Israel? What types of checks and balances should exist with regard to the actions of government? Should the Supreme Court be restricted from reviewing government initiatives? Is the country ready to adopt a constitution that will clearly guarantee protection of civil rights? Consideration of such fundamental issues raises the question whether the Israeli public has the tools to form opinions on these matters. Is it possible to conduct, and I will say multi-partisan cooperation in the case of Israel? Is it possible to conduct multi-partisan cooperation while maintaining civility among different groups? With regard to civility, anybody observing the debates in Parliament and in media reporting would surely agree that there is much to be desired in this area. As far as civics education, this is a required class in state-run high schools and one of the subjects in the matriculation examinations. The civics education program and required materials are approved by the Ministry of Education and are designed to provide students with knowledge of the components of the political, social, and economic system in Israel. The program is further designed to encourage students to apply their knowledge and skills when they evaluate topics that may be controversial. Some commentators have indicated that the mandatory materials have been updated in recent years to expose students to views that support the current proposed legal reforms. It is also interesting to note that nonprofit organizations, think tanks, law professors' forums, and practitioners have volunteered to raise civics awareness and understanding of the scope and potential effect of the proposed reforms on the legal system and the foundation of government in Israel. Complex issues of comparative law appear to be part of the conversation by both proponents and opponents of the reforms. I think this is remarkable that such discussions are now taking place outside of the ivory towers of academia. The crisis over the government proposal, legal reforms, has brought to the surface fundamental issues that were left unanswered since the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948. Discussions over the implications of the Jewishness of the state on the law, the extent to which majority rule may apply in a democracy, the place of checks and balances in a democratic system, and whether Israel is ready to adopt a constitution are among issues that the Israeli public has been recently exposed to. Some argue that the heated debate over the proposed reforms has contributed to a wider civic engagement and to deeper knowledge and understanding of civics among Israelis. On March 27, 2023, just recently, following mass protests, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced a temporary delay in promoting the government reforms, although not before forwarding for final reading a bill that would give the coalition control over the naming of Supreme Court justices. Israel's president, Yitzhak Herzog, immediately invited political leaders from the coalition and the opposition to start negotiations. According to Herzog, and I'm citing, "This is a potential constitutional moment, a moment in which we can direct Israel towards a stronger and more resilient structure, something we have not done since our establishment 75 years ago." End quote. In Herzog's opinion, the president was perhaps the only component of the Israeli system of government that all sides can feel free to trust and come and talk to. I will end here being cautiously optimistic that the president and the opposing camps will meet the challenge. I will be happy to provide more information in the Q&A segment.
Ruth, thank you so much for that well-presented, very rich and insightful presentation. It was excellent and I'm sure very illuminating. And the people that are able to view it in the recorded version are also going to be able, I think, to absorb all that information. Thank you. I have a follow-up question, but an observation first. And the follow-up question is for all three of our panelists. But the observation is, Ruth, I guess it's good company to realize that things are complex outside of the United States, and with Kayahan, we observe that there are similar difficulties and challenges experienced around the world and in other places. And it's also a takeaway is that both of you concluded from your work that civic education, civic legal education can be taught, that it's learnable. And so what I'm going to take away from that is in the United States, for whatever reasons, this is an observation, not a criticism, but there is less education in schools, colleges, universities about the founding principles and the evolution of law and justice in the United States. There just is. There's fewer professors, there's fewer courses, it's documented, it's established. Lawyers and law professors are ideally suited to fill in and provide that information. And so whether they're part of a law school or in a formal program, but every lawyer can and must fill in the gap to do what can be done, which is to educate the public about how laws work. So that's it. Now here's for my question. Forgive me, that was just an observation, not a sermon, I hope. Here's my question. Based on history, Mark Twain is credited with saying, he didn't really say it, but he's credited with saying that history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. What in history, in countries outside the United States or within the United States, are examples we can look to where we have come together despite differences to advance law and justice? I don't mean to put any of you on the spot, but maybe Deborah, I can think of several examples, but I leave it to you, our president.
Yeah,
to begin.
well, thank you for that. I think three come to mind immediately. One is the Civil Rights Act in 1964. That was bipartisan. And interestingly, in the ABA Civics Survey that was just released, we're talking about compromise, 57% of the respondents said they were opposed to compromising on voting rights. As in, so we have the 64 Voting Rights Act, and now we see voting rights are still at the forefront of our discussions today. Another example is, it wasn't so long ago that Supreme Court justices, the nominees, were confirmed by wide majorities of senators on both sides. It's only been in the most recent years that we have not seen that level of compromise or bipartisanship. But most recently, we did see that there was bipartisanship support for the Daniel Atterall Judicial Security Act. And for those who are not aware, this was the act that was passed that unfortunately grew out of the tragic murder of Justice Salas's son, and Congress came together to promote judicial security. Now, I'm mindful that in two of those three examples, they were spurred to action because of tragedy. The 64 Voting Rights Act, there was a lot of turmoil around that, and of course with the Judicial Security Act. I'm not suggesting that the only time people can come together is after tragedy, but there does seem to be something that can be galvanizing about that. So we need to recognize that we have opportunities to collaborate and have bipartisanship in ways that don't necessarily call for that kind of tragedy to spur us on.
Well, thank you. And boy, there's a lot in the comments that you made, including that the progress over time in American history has come through both creeps and jerks. And it sounds funny, but long progress in small steps with setbacks, such as the ABA Law Library of Congress traveling exhibits, the most three that I can think of, the right for women's, and then women of color, still unfulfilled, completely unfulfilled equal voting rights of everybody in the population who could be voting. The Come Together, most recent traveling exhibit, and others. And then others are galvanized. That was a great word that you used, by an event. And you can think of the 9/11 Patriot Act, the anti-terrorist, or the post-Enron and then post Great Recession Dodd-Frank legislations coming out of a sudden, as my old boss Moynihan would say, of a sudden. So we can come together and make progress, but the hardest ones are the big, very complicated issues: guns, the world, food security, environmental security, about the world that we live in. All these issues are very difficult and take time to work on. How about the overseas perspective and from history? What might other things can give us confidence? Ruth, you want to start? And then
Yes.
I'll go.
Yes. So a historic moment embodying the spirit of multi-partisanship in the Israeli context, I believe, was the 1992 adoption of two basic laws, specifically the Basic Law of Human Dignity and Liberty and the Basic Law of Freedom of Occupation, referring to vocation. Both basic laws include a provision stating that, quote, the basic human rights in Israel are based on the recognition of the value of the human being, the sanctity of life, and a person's freedom, and they shall be upheld in the spirit of the principles in the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel, end quote. Some scholars argue that these provisions have revolutionized the normative status of the Declaration of Independence. According to these scholars, prior to the basic laws of human dignity and liberty and of freedom of occupation, the Declaration of Independence was recognized by the courts as only a guiding source for interpreting legislation. The provisions referencing the declaration in the 1992 basic laws, in their view, transformed the declaration from a guiding source for interpretation to an independent source of human rights in Israel that can be enforced through judicial review. However, this view is opposed by others. According to the basic law, human dignity and liberty, the rights accorded by the basic law cannot be violated save by means of a law that corresponds to the values of the State of Israel, which serves an appropriate purpose, and to an extent that does not exceed what is required or on the basis of an explicit authorization in such a law. Uriel Lin headed the Knesset, Israel's Parliament Constitution and Law Committee in 1992, when the Basic Law, Human Dignity and Liberty Bill was adopted into law. He recently commented in an op-ed published in an Israeli newspaper that the Basic Law was, quote, in fact, a historic project of the Likud movement, although, of course, it was not the Likud alone that ultimately prompted the completion of the legislation. The Likud is Prime Minister Netanyahu's party, which now heads efforts to pass the legal reforms that opponents fear would prevent judicial review of executive actions that may violate the Basic Law. Proponents of the reforms have rejected these concerns and argue that there was no basis for such concerns. It is possible that the ongoing discussions currently taking place to achieve consensus over the reforms may address these concerns.
Thank you very much. Everything that comes out of your mouth could go right into a book in printed form. It's perfect. It's just perfect. We're learning so much. Johan, you have tough shoes to follow, to fill.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my personal view on this, and let me now make the usual disclaimer that you know, what I'm about to say is my own opinion, and it doesn't reflect the United States or the law library, of course. Is that the eunuch actually touched upon it. Times of disaster, natural disasters, for example. These are times when you know, members of the society, they are reminded, we are reminded of our common humanity. And I think that leads to a moment of understanding and cooperation and compromise that, you know, is not the usual status quo. This happens not only, I think, at the, you know, at the level of the national legislature or you know, but also like more below at the civic level, and we have seen examples of how civic cooperation at the you know, sub-government level has happened during national disasters in Turkey, which unfortunately happened, you know, experienced a terrible earthquake. But before that, globally, we experienced COVID in all countries in the world. And what we saw, for example, in Turkey, because Turkey is my main jurisdiction, that's why I'm, you know, I've been observing that country in particular, is that we've seen, you know, civilians starting nonprofit organizations very, very quickly, nonprofit associations under the civil code to engage in all kinds of support and help operations that the government either did not have the capacity to immediately fulfill, such as helping the animals on the street, for example. In many large cities in Turkey, there are a lot of stray animals, and these stray animals are as part of the culture usually taken care of by the people in the neighborhood. But when the COVID lockdowns happened, nobody were able to go and feed these animals. So you could see that immediately within neighborhoods, people came together and started these beneficial associations, collecting money and helping the animals out. Or not only the animals, of course, all people who did not have any relatives and that sort of thing as well. So complementing the governmental services, come people from all kinds of backgrounds and political opinion, of course. And this happened in many countries in the world, in the United States, in Italy, which I'm also familiar with. Neighborhood organizations, just and that maybe also goes to what you said about the role of lawyers. I mean, this example in particular is it is law. It's civil law. If you teach people how to form beneficial associations, they do it. So if you give the tools, people do something with it. And I think law is a very powerful tool in the hands of active citizens to come together and achieve things. One question, though, is why we have to be reminded of our common humanity and dignity by natural disasters. I think that is the lesson there. We shouldn't be reminded.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think the biggest takeaway is it's not easy, but it's something we have to continuously do and can do, and as lawyers must do, whether it's in response to a catastrophe, an accident, a crisis, or something that shocks the consciousness, or whether it's a common endemic problem that we have to work on. So do we have time to take, we've got a record-breaking number of people listening in and participating. I'm wondering if we have time to take any questions. We have one very important final speaker that we want to have time for. So I'm going to ask the ABA staff, who are my keepers here.
Could I just
Sure.
interject briefly? So as you know, many of us will know that we have a survey. The ABA does a survey on civic literacy every year. And this year's results are just being released, like literally, I think today we had the kickoff. And there's some great information in there about in the US, what our citizens, it's the fifth year that we've done this survey. And we look at it as an annual measure of the public's knowledge of government and history and the Constitution. And this year there was some really interesting results because we asked specifically about civility. And the statistic that jumped out at me right away was that the survey showed that an overwhelming majority of people, that is 85% of the respondents, said that civility is worse in our society compared to 10 years ago. Now, I think if we've reflected on that, we could probably say, yeah, we've seen, a lack of civility and that's increased, but 85% said, it's far worse than 10 years ago. the respondents say that we should compromise, that they want our elected officials to compromise. But interestingly, as I said, when put to specific questions about compromise, 57% said they wouldn't compromise or don't think we should compromise on voting rights. And then when asked about what are the causes of incivility, social media and media at large bear a lot of that responsibility. So when we see this and knowing this, then I think that can help us to shape the kinds of responses that we need, the kinds of tools that we need to be able to get to a point in society where we do have more civility. And one last statistic, more than a third of the respondents said that the task of improving civility starts with family and friends. So just kind of putting that in context, we do have to step up as lawyers and leading in our society and demonstrating civility, but also giving our citizens the tools that they need. Because as has been said here, you can learn to be civil. You can learn how to do it. It takes active participation and it takes a commitment, but it is possible. And so the conversations like this and having the kinds of tools that we provide on our Cornerstones of Democracy. We've got a website that has all kinds of information on how to have difficult conversations, how to move them forward. Those are the kinds of things that I think we should be reminded of, that we've identified the problem. Now, what are some solutions?
What an incredibly timely, not surprising, but important survey. Thank you for that. And your comments are motivational. I'll just add something. All of us lawyers are trained this way, but here's another way we can educate people about civility. It's how people see us conduct ourselves and speak to other people in our profession, especially, but not just in our professional responsibility. And so we can set the example. And frankly, I think that sometimes the softer and more genteel and more civil you are, the louder it speaks, the more impressive it is. I'm old enough to remember watching not newsreels, but I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to read documentaries about the famous Army McCarthy hearings. And the things that brought Senator McCarthy down, the devastating coup de grace, was attorney from Boston, Robert Welch, holding his fire and finally saying, "Have you no decency, sir? At long last, have you no decency?" And from that point on, McCarthyism was broken. So I'm just suggesting that we all, by acting as professionals with decorum, not being soft, not being vigorous advocates, but following the rules and being civil, can set an admirable example that'll have a leveraging effect throughout the population. And it doesn't have to be in a courtroom. It can be around the dinner table when you have these conversations. And I know, because in my diverse family, for example, the Sunday dinner conversation about American elective politics is more dangerous than the Afghan-Pakistan border. So I know how tough it can be. Okay. Yep. If we have time, perhaps there's some questions from the audience.
I think there was one question, if you don't mind. It looks like it was asking about the ABA's involvement with federal judicial nominees. And how important is it that attorneys advocate for the legal profession and the rule of law? Just to explain, the ABA has a standing committee on the federal judiciary, and we perform the function of evaluating nominees, judicial nominees for the federal courts at every level. And we do that in a non-partisan, or I should say bipartisan way. We have Republicans and Democrats that are part of that committee, and they review a nominee's record with the goal towards evaluating them, and the evaluation is either qualified, well qualified, not qualified. And it has nothing to do with their political affiliation. It's really about judicial temperament and their understanding of the law and those kinds of objective factors. And we have had the administrations for many years look to the ABA for those kinds of evaluations, including most recently when Ketanji Brown Jackson was a nominee. Our chair of the Federal Judiciary Committee actually testified before Congress about the ABA process. So I do think it's important that as a legal profession, bar associations have the ability to evaluate judicial candidates. And I think it's one of the strengths in the ABA that we have a judicial division and that we're able to work with judges and to provide that kind of service to the profession and to the public.
As a congressional staffer on the United States Senate Judiciary Committee, which handles confirmation of judges, and as a law professor and law dean who had many of his professors assist the ABA process, I can tell you that the ABA reports are extremely helpful, very thorough, very substantive, not partisan, and extremely well regarded and useful. And so I just wanted to suggest, and that culls a lot of the information that comes from the profession. It's not some individuals just making it up.
Yeah.
Also, as attorneys, you have an opportunity at your local, state, and federal levels to review judges, and taking the opportunity to complete the requests for feedback about judicial performance is extremely important to do. So that's something everybody can do to maintain the high standard of judicial officers that we have enjoyed in this country. So, are there any other questions?
I think there's some in the chat.
Now I see. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, or in the Q&A box.
Right. Okay. The Q&A box. Maybe.
You want me to?
You're in the right. If you can just, why don't you just take over?
Sure. So here's one that says, thank you all. How do you balance the individual freedom and the general will? Yes.
That's a deep philosophical question.
I think
I go ahead. Thank you, Ruth. Jump in and take it if you want.
Well, I think this is very relevant in the current conflict in Israel. It's actually one of the central issues. What is the extent to which the majority has the power to define certain things that could affect the individual? So I hope this is what I believe this is the question, correct? So is it enough that the majority has the power, or should it be restricted if it affects the individuals? And what should be the framework for handling this? So in the case of the United States, maybe it is easier because there is a framework by way of having a constitution and certain the relationship between the individual or individual rights and the power of the majority are supposed to be clear or clearer.
Thank you. That was courageous that you stepped in. I'm going to try. That question is a fundamental core question about government in general, democracy in particular, and the United States. I'm going to try to answer that very briefly, and you can grade the answer. Just don't tell anybody what the grade is. The only caveat is I studied philosophy and political theory, and from that study overseas, the only thing I still remember or took away was that if I'm alone in the woods and there's no one there and I say something and my wife's not there, I'm still wrong. So that's the only thing that I remember. Okay, so anyway, I'm going to try to answer this question. Because America was founded under principles of freedom and the wanting to be left alone from government, getting away from people telling you what you do. Now, that was not equal, and there was slavery, and there were only some people were entitled to those rights. But the basic fundamental idea is freedom. However, we must live together despite our differences and despite that we have different things we want to be free to do. And so, practically speaking, how are you going to live together despite your differences? So our approach is our Constitution and the rule of law. And so where we end up, and it's a dynamic question, it's constantly evolving and changing, but where we up is we all agree that there's certain things that we can't do for ourselves. And so we need government to do that. And so we have a limited government that we say we give you our consent to abide by the rules under the Constitution, but only to do the things that we don't want to do ourselves. And by the way, we want to make sure that we have our freedom and rights, and we've got the Bill of Rights, and we have other principles throughout the Constitution. And then that's been evolved. And then on top of all of that, we have the very complex, unique system of two levels of government, federal, national, and state. And I'm deep into reading a book right now about this, a brand new book. But the original way that was going to work in practice was never conclusively decided before the Constitution was approved, immediately after, and up to this day. So that also, it's a very dynamic and fluid conversation, and we have to figure these things out on an ongoing basis. We have to build the plane while we're flying it continuously. And you can't do that if you're not civil, civic, and collaborating. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Professor.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's great. So there are two questions that touch on civility versus decorum. So I'm gonna, they're two, and they're similar themes. So let me see if I can try and synthesize them. So it's, how do you differentiate between civility and decorum? And so the example is that people are weaponizing decorum so that it says, for example, the rules of decorum are now being wielded to silence minority voices, such as what happened in expelling the Tennessee Three, and are being used to as a way of saying you're out of order and not acting with civility, and then using that as a way of silencing people that you don't agree with. So the question is, what would you recommend at the local level when public meetings become unruly? Some see decorum rules as a way to silence communities who don't have institutional political power. Any thoughts on that? So kind of putting the two together, is there a difference between civility and decorum? And how do we make sure that people aren't using decorum as a weapon to silence others?
These are great questions and they're tough. Because we've seen several examples where people who were admittedly not civil, and to a degree, they were speaking about things they cared about deeply, and they weren't apparently able to get attention otherwise. So they were trying to make a point. But their breach of rules of decorum were certainly used to try to silence their voices. And the ones that in the example that you given, they're back in the legislature now because our system is sort of self-correcting in that regard, and they gain more attention for what they were saying. So there's another current example of a woman, I can't remember what state it is and what level, who's transgender.
I think it's Montana because they've asked.
That's right, it's in Montana, right? So
Mhm.
her ability to serve in her government role, her elected role, is in jeopardy, apparently. So it's a very tough question. But the thing about democracy is, I think that if it's obviously and a triumph of decorum over civility, if it's a triumph to silence people, that ultimately our democracy is sloppy. Churchill said that it's the worst of all systems until you consider the alternatives. And though we slide backwards and it's painful and confusing and worrisome, we eventually seem to get there. And so we can be, I think, I prefer to be optimistic that it'll work out. I don't think there's a good, this is my answer. I don't think there's a good answer about that. I think we all have to work together. Civility is very important. Decorum helps you maintain civility, but if it's used abusively and to silence people, I mean, there's nothing harder than the First Amendment. The First Amendment is great when it enables you and protects your freedom to say what you want, and it's annoying as heck when it protects the rights of people who want to say things that you really don't like and in fact abhor. So it's a tough thing. But I think over the long run, I prefer to be optimistic than pessimistic. I don't think there's a clear, crisp answer to that very tough, sophisticated question. Are there, we've really been testing people's patience. Is there maybe one more central question or another question we might take a swipe at?
Sure, let's see. How do we get more high schools to teach government, civility, democracy, to educate the electorate before citizens get to voting age? Well, I will take a little bit of this one. I think that's part of what our Cornerstones of Democracy project is trying to do, is promote civics education. I will say when I was visiting with some US senators back in September and talked about this effort, one in particular said, yeah, I tried to introduce civics, a bill to talk about civics and civic importance of civic education. And all of a sudden I got all of this pushback because people were concerned that it was a way of trying to indoctrinate students. And so I think part of it has to be, it's a curriculum that is carefully crafted for with a local understanding, but it has to be the basics. And it's going to take all of us going into our communities to really promote the importance of civic education, because we are seeing a generation that don't understand the different branches of government, and that makes them subjective to misinformation and miseducation. And that's part of the whole social media and media aspects. We've really got to partner with these social media and media companies to promote better education of what is factual and what is not factual. That is so very important. And, you know, because I was a journalism major, degree in journalism, I feel that I can say this to journalists in particular. It does a lot of damage when they say Trump appointed judges, Biden appointed judges. Now, that may be accurate, but it does serve to underscore divisions in ways that are not necessary or helpful. So I think it's going back to basics. It's starting at the local levels. It's using the tools that have been described in terms of introducing the subject matter, but making sure that we all understand why it's important to do it, and then having the will to put civics education back into our schools.
Yeah, I would just add, it's participating and encouraging the budgeting. The existing administrators and faculty of secondary and elementary schools have so much on their hands and so many challenges. So I would urge that in addition to showing up and trying to get them the resources and identifying this as a subject matter that's worth study, this is again something not to wait for others to do it, for every lawyer can participate. I'll give you some specific examples that will make this very highly educated and thoughtful audience. You're thoughtful and to be complimented for participating and listening here. It shows that your heart, your mind is in the right place. I just, before this, I'll show you this so you don't think I'm making this up. It probably looks backwards.
No, we got it.
Okay, before the session, I attended the Law Day Clay County Bar Association program for Law Day, observing Law Day, and the speakers included the Chief Justice of Florida, Carlos Munoz, who gave a very thoughtful discussion on many of the topics you're hearing about today, but also they awarded the Jim Thies Award to one of their student, meaning high school student members, his award for outstanding participation in the mock trial, moot court, and civic service projects that the Bar Association sponsors. And it was this remarkable high school student who got $1,000 award or $1,500 award, was celebrated. And he's already, by the way, I immediately gave him my card and invited him to talk to me about coming to the Jacksonville University College of Law. And his parents were there. But these are the things, and each of us and our students here are making ourselves available. Frequently, we get requests for high schools to come and talk about a law topic, talk about a constitutional law topic, or we're going to be doing this, put on a show. Our students and our faculty and other people can do a mock trial that students get to attend. They're fascinated. They want to learn about law, and they may not ever have the idea of law as a future for them, but also at a minimum, they can understand something about the system. So I just said there's lots of things that lawyers can do to help advance civic legal education. So on that, I think we've taxed everybody's patience, although the content was incredible, with the exception of the moderator talking too much. But I would like to wrap this wonderful recorded event up by calling one of the public servants who I admire the most. Now, I love librarians and libraries anyway, but I will tell you that the Law Library of Congress has the most dedicated, most incredibly skillful, thoughtful, and productive law librarian you can possibly imagine. And so with that buildup, she's going to soar even above that buildup. I ask Ashulan Bulat, the Law Librarian of Congress, to bring us home, wrap this up.
Wow, Nick, you know, you're going to have to do my eulogy.
Not for, go
Well,
ahead.
hello, everyone. Yes, I'm Maslahan Bulut, and I do have the privilege and honor of serving as the Law Librarian of Congress. I just want to take a moment to thank President Enix Ross, Dean Allard, Ms. LaVouche, and Mr. John Tekin for this engaging and thought-provoking discussion, and thank the audience for their incredible questions and for joining us today to celebrate Law Day. I want to invite you to visit Law Library's Legal Research Institute online at law.gov to learn more about our upcoming events and webinars. And please visit the American Bar Association at americanbar.org to learn more about Law Day and events that commemorate Law Day. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Aslian. Thank you so much. Thank everybody, all the panelists, and especially thank you to all the participants. Spread the word around, share some of these ideas, and let us know what more we can do. Thank you all so much. We'll sign off. Happy Law Day.